Well, hello out there and welcome. I'm Danny Lichtenfeld, Director of the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. Thank you for tuning in for this event, our second live streamed talk from the museum. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. Tonight's talk with Stephen Rose was originally planned to take place here at the museum, of course, but the pandemic laid waste to those plans. Stephen's installation was one of 8 new exhibits that opened on March 14th, only to close the very next day. And they've remained closed since then, but I'm delighted to say that we're opening back up to the public next Thursday, June 18th. And these exhibits that have been sitting in the dark all this time have been extended through October 12th. So I hope you'll have a chance to come and see Stephen's installation and our other exhibits in person in the months ahead. Here's how this event is going to work tonight, theoretically anyway. I will be leaving the screen shortly when Stephen begins his talk. And when he finishes, probably at around 8:15 or so, I'll come back on and we'll have a Q&A. If you are connected here via Zoom, then there are a couple ways you can participate in the Q&A. You can type in your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it there, but you kind of hover your mouse around at the bottom of your screen, it should pop up. And you can type in your questions using that Q&A button either during the talk or afterwards when we get to the Q&A. The other option, which is only available during the actual Q&A session, is to use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. When you do that, we'll be notified that you want to ask a question and we'll be able to unmute you and you can ask your question yourself rather than typing it in. But again, we'll only use that function during the Q&A session, not during the talk itself. You'll see there's also a chat button there. That is for you to send a message to me or to our invisible yet indispensable events manager, Jessica Nelson, if you're having any technical issues or something else that you think we can help with. You use the chat button. Now, if you're on here via Facebook Live or YouTube Live and you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, just use the comment function on those platforms and Jessica will be monitoring that and relaying those comments to me when we get to the Q&A. Before I turn this over to Stephen Rose, there are a few people I would like to thank. First is Jessica for making this Zoom magic happen tonight. This is all pretty new to us and we have her to thank for it working well. Next is our chief curator, Mara Williams, who is responsible for Stephen's work appearing at our museum. Thank you, Mara. And I'd also like to thank our exhibitions manager, Sarah Freeman, building manager, Ananda Forrest, our excellent electrician, Doug Cleveland, and especially Stephen himself for their heroic efforts to get the installation just right, not only from an aesthetic and conceptual standpoint, but also from the standpoint of the electrical inspector, which was no small task. So thank you to all of you for that. Okay, for those of you who don't know Stephen, he is an artist based in Queens, New York, Jackson Heights to be specific, and also in Southern Vermont. He has worked in photography and mixed and digital media for over 20 years, and he holds a Master's of Fine Art in Photography from Hunter College. At the Brattleboro Museum, we've known Stephen for many years as Emily Mason's assistant and studio manager. And it's been really wonderful over the past year to get to know Stephen as an artist doing incredibly powerful work himself. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to Stephen Rose.
Hello, I guess I'm here. Excellent. I think we're rolling. So I should start out with my thank yous, and you know, thank you, Danny, for that introduction. I also want to thank Mara Williams, who saw this installation that I made back in 2018 in Brooklyn and said this would be great up in Brattleboro and allowed me to do this. Also, thank you, Jessica and Aaron Jenkins, and Sarah Freeman, Ananda Forrest, and yes, of course, thank you, Doug Cleveland. It was a little hairy for a while there, but you helped guide us through, and I think the piece is better because of the work we did together. I also want to just thank my partner, Mylene, and my little one, Lennox, through whose eyes I am becoming a better artist every day. And before I get started, I do want to give thanks to all of my friends, my family, all my brothers and sisters out there who are activated and pushing for change right now. So we bear the burden of this pandemic, and there's been a proposal of rampant defunding to our schools, cultural arts, and humanities. I think it behooves us that we consider realigning our priorities where health and culture are the nurturers of our inherent social pact, and in opposition to the flawed enforcement system that we currently live under. So with that in mind, let's do a little nurturing and talk art. I prepared a little bit of a slideshow. This is not a usual format for me. What's really interesting about this is I can't see any of you. I'm talking to myself, which is kind of unusual. I do a little bit, but not at this formal level. So just bear with me. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll start talking some art. Excuse me 1 second. All right, and here we go. So observations on natural progressions towards away from the familiar. I've been thinking a lot about this. As Danny said, I've been working in New York as an artist for nearly 20 years now. And when I was asked to do this presentation, this is the first large scale presentation I've done in a public forum. I wanted to think about like, what is the linear thread that takes me from the beginning of my work to the end of my work. Obviously the themes change as I move along, but I think what remains consistent throughout my work is that I like to observe what is inherent in the familiar, the things that are closest to us, the things that we sometimes take for granted. It could be as local as grabbing a bowl of cereal and adding some milk to it and having some breakfast. It could be as profound as an earthquake. So this is where I'm moving from, and this is kind of the pose that I've taken and strategized around in my artwork. Let's see what we have. So the piece that I did for Brattleboro Museum is called For Wild, and it's a piece that changes for every installation I do it, site specific. The first installations of it were very small and confined to a small gallery, and they've changed in scope and size and how they behave. So I'm going to show you a video of the piece as it was installed on March 15th before it closed down and before the electrical inspector came and shut it down. So I'm going to run this video, and while I run this video, you'll get a sense of the piece. And the first thing you might notice, you might hear a little bit of the fan in the background. And what that is the device by which this thing moves. So for those of you that read about the work, it was inspired by an experience that I had in, I believe it was, I want to say it's 2011, 2012. A small earthquake struck New York City. It came up from Virginia. It was like a 5.8 in Virginia at the center, and it reverberated up the coast. And by the time it hit us, it was like a 2.5 or something like that. And I happened to be working at the Board of Elections, which at that time overlooked what is now the Hudson Yards. And while I was sitting there, the whole place moved like jello. It was a really interesting feeling and experience. I looked up from the computer I was working on, and I heard alarms going off, and I looked up and I saw this place, just vast expanse of 8-foot lamps all moving in unison along their length. Now, in my experience, or my idea of an experience, an earthquake is something that is pronounced by a camera shake. It's chaos. It's the disorder. It's nature causing this infliction upon humans, as if we exist outside of that. And I found that to be perplexing. I was struck by an extremely sublime experience of meditation, and seeing things like a child again. They all moved, they all swayed in unison. I was transfixed by it. And it struck me. And what I wanted to do with this piece is not necessarily recreate the earthquake experience per se, but to find a way, both physically and visually in the image, manifest what it felt like to observe it at that time, to subvert expectations. And this is the solution I came up with. I want to have 3 lights moving in sequence. I want as little as possible to be the cause of their movement. So I use these extremely small fans, which I've decided not to hide anymore. And each fan is breathing just a little breath at a time to keep these things moving in sequence. And it's subtle enough that I think in a lot of the installations that I've done, you can move in and not even recognize that it's moving. And I like this. I like that it's something that can kind of exist in your periphery. And I think that's a really necessary component, that in any natural observation, sometimes you don't necessarily see it happening right before your eyes. Sometimes it's something that only happens when you're ready for it. So this, I think, is my most successful installation of this piece. I had a great time doing it. What's interesting is what Danny alluded to, the electrical inspector came. So those wires that you see coming from the lights are no longer there. They're now replaced by a metal sheath. And it looks even more like an institutional fixture. So it's even going to be more subtle. So again, I thank you, the electricians that helped make that possible, and add a little professionalism to this whole thing. So the next thing I want to show you is another manifestation of For a While. This is one I did in 2018 at an installation in Brooklyn. This is the one that Mara came to see. And I call this one Low Boy. And this one greeted you as you walked through the door. It just was sitting down there, moving away, and knocking into some people's legs at times. It was I thought it was quite entertaining. And I think had a profound experience. So it's all by itself as opposed to having an array of them above you. And as you can see in the different manifestations, it has a little different effect. This also might be in your periphery. You might question what force is actually moving that, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same piece. What you might have seen in that last video I showed you is also in the current installation at Brattleboro Museum. Is, for lack of a better way of talking about it, is I would call it my self-portrait, a signature. It's my monkey. This piece is born out of a lot of web browsing on my part. For a long time, I've been fascinated with these porcelains that were coming out of West and Eastern Germany, particularly during the heyday, post Darwin and Enlightenment. And what I noticed is a lot of these artisans, particularly the really good ones, were working on animals. They were finding ways of creating animals and anthropomorphizing them, or even if it wasn't directly anthropomorphizing them, they were doing things that seemed like something that a human would do, maybe not in the manner a human would be doing it. And I thought it was really fascinating. I thought it was like a weird way of us looking in the mirror as creators. And I saw the monkeys show up over and over again. Monkeys were looking at turtles. They were looking at ladybugs. They were looking at themselves. There was like the hear no evil, see no evil. And I was also seeing it in other cultures as well. And so I decided I like that. I wanted to embrace that. I thought it was like it's an interesting concept in itself. And so I began to appropriate different aspects of the porcelain monkey and created my own. And I started out with a digital rendering and made this video out of it. And the idea, I think, is where I find myself really relating to the monkey is the observation of looking at oneself and through something that is a little bit less significant. So in the same ways that you see in For a While, where a small fan is blowing the lights, this little fly is transfixing this monkey. In the same way, I was this little thing while nature decided to create this earthquake that shook everybody up. So I do like that relationship, and I like that level of observation, that romantic pose, looking at that thing that's right in front of you that's somewhat insignificant. One addition that I did make to this piece that I think is also quite strange and surreal is the tail. It became a light. I mean a flower, and the flower is modeled after a tiger lily, and I just thought it was a nice kind of connection with nature. Like, this is our evolution, and to me, the tiger lily is something that exists throughout Vermont and in nature. You see it; it's ubiquitous, and so it seemed to be part of this whole conversation going along with this little figure. Moving along, I also like to do performance. And this piece is called, that I did at that Brooklyn space, it was called Somer Hot Towel. Now, Somer is a term that comes from an Ursula Le Guin novel called Left-Handed Darkness. And it refers to this transformation. For those of you who are not familiar with the book, it describes a society that is genderless, or actually they only become gender after a certain time, so you could be one gender or the other. And once this event happens, the Somer event happens, then the body chooses to become something that is definable as we would see it as a male or a female. And I thought I still think this concept is extremely liberating. Again, I like to concentrate on the things that are familiar. And this is our own bodies. This is what we are. And this piece, what I wanted to do was create a situation where we look at a very intimate interaction that we might overlook otherwise. In this case, the interaction that I was concentrating on is the hot towel massage that takes place for anybody that's been to a barber and gotten their hair done or has gotten a shave. There's always this moment at the end, everything is done, where they're cleaning you up and they do want a hot towel. And so you get this nicely smelling hot towel put around your face, and they massage your face, and then you have to pay now that you're in delirium, and you give a big tip, and then you walk out the door and you wonder what the hell just happened. So I love that. And I love that exists on, and also, let's be honest, I mean, a lot of barbershops, they do have they do imbibe a certain type of machismo sometimes. And there's a way that those interactions happen that this almost seems separate from it. And I find that also to be quite fascinating. So I decided what I wanted to do for this performance at this show was invite somebody to come in. This is my barber that I was using for a while. And all he was going to do was not cut hair, not do anything, but he was just going to allow the people who came to the opening and the closing to sit down and receive a wonderful hot towel massage on their face and rub in all the ointments and go on their merry way with no transaction at all. They don't have to pay for it. And that would be the piece. Of course, I recorded them too. So this is one individual getting up there, and Henry's performing the action. What you might not be able to see below our thumbnails is the full wrap around the face, but you can see he was doing this the whole night, and he was doing it in a big crowd. So anybody that was there could, it was a very intimate experience amidst this big crowd. And I love that about it. And so here he is doing it. This guy, Henry, is phenomenal. He brought out this hand massager that looks like some kind of torture device, but it helped massage the face and the scalp and just left a feeling of ecstasy. And what you can see at the end here is my friend, dear friend Fred, coming out of his massage with pure joy on his face without being prompted at all, for everybody to see. And opening himself up to the world in a different way, I hope. So that was the Somer performance, and we did that. We did quite a few of them. We did them both on both the opening and the closing. And this is a formal gesture that I want to recreate again someday soon. Another way that I like to make art, and this goes into the whole thing I was speaking about before about trying to work with the familiar. And along with working with things that are local to you, sometimes you have to put yourself out of your comfort zone. So over the years, I've often found that collaboration is essential to this. It's a strategy, and it's a strategy that I've used quite a few times. I've had 3 really, or maybe 4 really successful collaborations, and they're not easy. I mean, I see things that my collaborator might see and vice versa, and they make you do things you might not necessarily do. But this to me is probably one of my most successful collaborations I've done. It's called the Still Life. And what this is the Still Life was a concept that I had with my friend Joseph Montgomery, my studio mate. And what we wanted to do was create a suite of automated image making devices. We had been looking around us and seeing how, like, particularly, you know, after 2010, how rampant just everybody posting everything online all the time, how much just content was just overwhelming the system. So we're like, how do we get in there and actually distill these ideas and put them into a form that we can digest again as artists, and also present them in the world in a way that I think is transformative. And so we did this little play on words with the Still Life. And what we decided to do is, Joe had been working a lot with this format. For those of you who are not from New York, you might not know this. They change every year, but they're grocery store signs, and they're really ubiquitous. You see them as you're walking down. They'll just have them plastered all over a grocery store, you know, just like this, just like you're seeing right here. They'll be in different colors, red, blue. Sometimes they'll have pictures on them, but they're really basic, really kind of beautiful graphic pieces. And we thought that it was a great format for this concrete poetry that we wanted to create. So what did we do? We created these applications called grocery signs and grocery portraits. And what I'm going to do right now is actually step out of this system and show you actually how it works. And what this was is, I got to make sure I do this right so I don't lose everybody. Yes. And what this was is an application. And in this application, you can go into it and you can select any of these things. So everybody's leaving their reviews on eBay or marketing their materials, Etsy. It's all about what your wares are. Craigslist, we were trying to find, there was a lot of personal ads at the time that we created it. And then it was like rants and raves and things like that. Reddit, Twitter, Amazon reviews, OkCupid, Upwork. These are all places that people have been putting all their personal information out there that's publicly accessible. I'm not hacking anything, but what we decided to do is go ahead and just send this little critter through, scrape the material up, and then generate these posters. So this is one that I did off of Craigslist just before I got on here. And you plop it on, it plops into the format that we're setting up. And let's hope that it continues to work while I'm online. Yes, there we go. And you can see it creates this like kind of interesting dialogues that you don't expect, these unexpected dialogues. And some work and some don't, and you can reorganize it and play with it as a viewer. And every time somebody scrapes something, we had it saved to a database so that we can re-access it anytime we want.
Stephen, this is Danny. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
We're only seeing the keynote. We're not seeing your browser.
Oh, well, let me do that then. Let me go ahead and share. It says I'm screen sharing, but let me try going to.
I mean, we see your screen, but we're just seeing. Yeah, there you go.
How's that work?
That's better.
Now you can see everything?
I think so. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Where was I? Yes. So now you see the Craigslist. And then thank you, Danny. Thanks for letting me know. And then of course now you can see how you can scroll down. You can see Amazon, OkCupid, Upwork. Upwork is where you can have freelance people come on. And again, I'll show you how this is done. You go through generate, you create something, and you can pick a color, and this is what you get. And these kind of strange concrete poetry things. And every time it's scraped, it's saved to this database that Joseph and I can go ahead and re-access as we pleased anytime we want. So let me go ahead and stop sharing that. And I'm going to start sharing the PowerPoint. And I'm hoping that you can now see the PowerPoint.
We can.
Thank you, Danny. All right, so moving along. I just lost my PowerPoint. Okay. So as you can see, there's also something that we created called grocery portraits. And grocery portraits was a way that we decided to not make this just about going out there and being voyeurs of other people, but turning this tool inwards. So with that one, we actually were able to put in our credentials for Gmail or our Facebook, and then send the scraper onto ourselves. And I have to say it was quite embarrassing at times. But that was also part of this project. And what we got out of it was this insane database of images. And mind you, we didn't do all this individually. I actually, we worked on creating a headless version of ourselves. So a computer that went up and randomly generated these things. And as you can see, it just created so much content for us to mess with. Thousands upon thousands of these images came up, and for every image that was created, it was created into a database, and then that too was actually accessible by Google. So if you were to go onto Google and you were to look for user number 39 on OkCupid and look for their image, you wouldn't just see their OkCupid site. You would see the images that we were creating and injecting back into the web. So it was kind of a way that we were also trying to deal with noise by creating even more noise. We were trying to find strategies. How do we deal with all this content? And that was one of our strategies. So recently we did a show, Joseph and I. We decided we wanted to slow it down. We did that piece that you just saw, which was the scrolling through a lot of the things. We allowed people to scrape through things. But we also collaborated with Ruben Chappelle, who's a fashion house. They actually invited us to come in and use their space down in Chelsea to go ahead and do a show. And so we said, let's go for it. And would you like to go ahead and use some of our posters to make clothes with? And that's what they did. Currently, this is actually on view at a fashion museum over in Vienna as well. But it was a very strange mashup. So all of a sudden you have this, these advertisements now being worn by models. And then this picture in the middle that you can see is another strategy that we did, which was take them from their digital format and do this very painstaking process of transferring it onto rice paper that had a level of transparency. So this very organic looking, flowy, ephemeral object that had age to it just built into it. So as you can see, we installed these pieces all hanging together, curated, and they would just kind of blow while people walk by up and down the hallways. And then here's some of the models on the opening night wearing some of the clothing. In the foreground there, you'll see a pillow. We also made these pillows that that we used to pose with our models, which were these figures Joseph has been working with for years, his stick figures. Sorry, shim figures. And then here you go again. You can see another image of that. And in the background, you can see what we did where we actually laid out smaller thumbnails of those things. And then here it is again. And in these objects, you know, there is, of course, this level of humor that we played with randomness, but we also played with things that just caught our eye. And, you know, some things were there because they made us giggle. Some things just looked good. But yeah, a lot of different aspects governed our choices. So I'm going to finish with some objects. You know, a big part of my practice, like Danny was saying, I do a lot of photography, I do video. But also I like to make objects, and the objects do have a quality of all those things, and they do have a bit of a testimony in themselves. So I want to show you some of those. Something that I observed back in, I think probably I would say 2010, 2011, and you know, it still existed all the way up until recently, is a foodie culture gone rampant, particularly here in New York. Like every single page in New York Times, Time Out, whatever, it was always about going out and having the best piece of fried chicken you could possibly eat, or the best piece of pizza. And I just found it kind of insane. And so I wanted to start messing with that a little bit. And I did my own crawl, not for the best tasting chicken, but for the best looking chicken. And I found Mr. Chicken in the corner of a boulevard in Queens. And I bought a bunch of pieces, and I took a bite out of each one, and I took them home and I casted them. And I decided, you know, if we're going to fetishize food to this degree, why don't we just take it to one step further and bespeckle with crystal rhinestones the fleshiest, grossest part of the food. And so that's what these pieces are. These are my rhinestone fried chickens, and I made a series of 5 of these. And they exist as objects, and they also exist as props. And I also decided to take this food concept further. While I was in Milan doing an installation in 2015, I went to an exhibit on old Greek and Roman sculpture. And during this exhibit, what they were showing was how a lot of these ancient pieces, these bronzes, were actually painted and how they were painted. But they were done, a lot of them were done with patina. And what I found kind of humorous, but also telling about a lot of this stuff is the reason we know this is because they were able to retrieve pieces of these sculptures, and the pieces that they retrieved were typically appendages, so like ears and noses and genitalia. And I was like, well, that's really it's really a funny and interesting concept, particularly now in the years of emojis, and how can I transform that? And what I decided to do was actually take some fruit and have a dialogue with these old ancient sculptures and create these patinaed fruit. And not only did I want to do that, I also want to have this dialogue with the aesthetics of it. So in the Greek and Roman sculptures and the recreations, it was all about virility and having this like gusto of youth and spunk. And I wanted things that were aged. I wanted to find beauty and embody and encase that beauty of these things over time. And so I did these series of eggplants that I patinaed, and as well as apricots and peaches that aged for a long time, and then I casted them and created these bronzes. And these things exist as objects, but they also, I found, I wanted to reintroduce them to photography again, because that is my wheelhouse. And I started placing them with different scenarios. So the one on the left there was a good friend of mine was doing a fashion shoot, and she asked me, you know, we need props. Do you have something that you might want to give us? And I was like, well, I have a chair and some and these interesting bronzes. What do you think? And next thing I know, these were showing up in this nice fashion magazine, which I thought was quite funny. And then that piece in the middle is actually the piece that generated some of that content on the left. And then on the right, you see my chicken piece been transformed, and that was used for another collaboration I did with a porn magazine based out of Germany, where I was shooting bodies for both men and women, and using some of my objects in those to kind of help accentuate the fetishization and the ambiguity of those pieces. So that's those pieces. And then very recently, I looked inward again, and I saw in our studio these shelves that had just been messed with over the years, and you know, they're just like, to me, they're artist shelves. They have like the detritus of pigment and epoxies and paint, and you know, the act of the creative mind just going to town and just dripping stuff all over the place. And I was like, you know, this is phenomenal, but I also see that there's a bit of a humor to this, because we look at these things and we just think that they're, you know, they're kind of beautiful, cruddy objects, and they represent this whole, I wouldn't call it a myth, but just like this belief about the artist and what they're doing. What if I counterfeited them? What if I made multiples of them? So what I did is I took one of those shelves and I casted it, and I did a reprint of it essentially over and over again. So in this installation, I did 6 of these lined up completely identical on the top and everything on all that area that you see. And the only shift that I did is I took the mason jar and I made these rubber replicas that are all completely unique. So each one was defined by the rubber replica that was hanging on there. So this one, it was placed vertically, and you can see it kind of hanging there. And that was I think that was actually, you could see the side of that one too. So that's pretty, that one's quite successful, I think. And last, but definitely not least, is another collaboration that I did with my good friend Joanna Seitz. And we had worked for years together, and one of the commissions that we received early on working together was to do a piece in the middle of summer for a block party for Absolute Vodka. And a lot of artists were invited to do this. And I said, you know, Joanna and I work really well in photography. That doesn't really go well with a block party. what if we did a block of ice that would last in the middle of summer about 20 seconds? And they loved it, so we did it. And we continued to work with this format. It was a nice way of creating still lifes, we felt. It was a nice way of freezing it. And for both of us as photographers, and Joanna also works with prop design and such, it was a really interesting way of messing with the expectations. You expect these things to be forever, to be in resin. In this case, they melted, they became detritus, they rotted on the floors in this case when they were installed in this gallery in Detroit. And they became nothing again, which I think is quite nice. So that's that. That was my final object. I would like to just leave you with a recent object. This is a studio process video that's about 2 minutes long. And to me, I accidentally played this for Danny yesterday when I was talking to him, but I think it encapsulates a lot of this way of looking at things through multiple lenses. So there's some volume to this, and I'll just let this play. And then when this finishes, Danny's going to take over, and we'll have some times for questions.
Oh, that was such a good way to end. Thank you, Stephen. Oh, I love seeing your other work. I have a question real quick about that last piece that you just showed us, and then but then I really want to open it up to others to ask questions. And so it's probably just my internet connection here in Vermont, but the audio is kind of wonky on that. But so basically, what we're looking at is a video of that iguana with a soundtrack that you've put to it.
Yeah.
But you're showing us like a still image of the video in some context, you know, on some kind of device in some context, rather than just showing us the video.
Yeah, that's. I think that's. I think that's why I like that, is because it has a few levels of removal. So it really is about the studio process. The sounds that you're hearing in the background was actually a studio mates of mine playing their music really loud, and then you hear a lot of me banging around. Actually, I think I was installing a version of 4 While in my studio at the time and dropping lights all over the place. And in the meantime, during that chaos, you have this video. I don't think you need that context. Maybe it might not play maybe the audio though. There's multiple levels of that audio happening there. But I do like the still frame of it. And what I think I also enjoy about that piece is that the high resolution of this image of the iguana is almost more high resolution than real life.
Yeah.
Like the surrounding, the sound, it all feels like background.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
that to me is kind of interesting in concept.
Totally agree. Yeah, that's so cool. So Stephen, thank you for this. So generous of you to put this together, to take time to share your work with us, and you're so eloquent and clear in speaking about your work. And I know it's a tough format to do it when you don't have any immediate obvious feedback. So thank you. This was just terrific. I want to encourage all of you out there to use the Q&A function if you have questions, or I think you can do this thing where you choose the raise hand function, in which case I can call on you and you can ask your question in person. And while we're waiting, oh, here we go. So let me see it. Was the video image shot by you, or was it found, maybe repurposed footage? That's a question from Mara. Hi, Mara.
Hi, Mara. Yes, actually, that's a good question. I actually shot that piece. I was at oh man, I forget the name of it, but I was down in Miami, and we came walking across this gigantic iguana.
Nice. So I want to tell you what I love about the piece that we have up at the museum right now, and that it seems to me is really in play with some of the other work that you showed us as well. I love artwork that exists at the fringes of what we think of as art, or what we might recognize as art, and kind of plays with the distinction between our everyday surroundings and everyday objects and what is art. And one of the things, there are really two things that I just find so great about that kind of art. One is that, you know, I'll never be anywhere and see those kinds of lights hanging and not think about that, not see the world in a different way, for, you know, having seen your piece. So that's one thing, is that, you know, after the experience of the artwork, you see the world in a different way. But the other thing is that, you know, when I encounter art like that, it's a reminder that, you know, what is art and what isn't art, like, really has to do with your perception and what you're choosing to perceive as art. Because if I were just in this warehouse looking at these lights, it might not dawn on me to think of those as art, or, you know, that's an artful and aesthetic experience I'm having. But now I will think of them that way. And so I just love that kind of work in general. And it's the case with the barber chair too, like the hot towel. I'm never going to be able to now have a hot towel and you know, and not be thinking along those lines, and the grocery signs as well. So I just really appreciate that about your work, and really enjoy it.
No, thank you. Yeah, I hope that next time you see a tiger lily on the side of the road, you think that there might be a monkey somewhere on the other end of that thing.
Yeah, totally.
But I do think that's important. It's trying to find a way just to tweak something just a little bit, and that can completely transform it. And I think when that happens, that's where the real interest lies. And it's a lot I've learned. Like I said it earlier on, I mean, a lot of this is the way I've always played for 20 years. But I tell you, in the last almost 20 months, watching my little guy, Lennox, you know, become observant of the world. That's what artists want to do. They want to see things through children's eyes again. They want to create with that kind of fluidity. I don't have the capacity to like completely do that in the way I make things, but I can at least look at the world in that way and try to synthesize the poetic in that manner.
Absolutely. So I have a few questions stacked up here. Was the second installation also powered by a fan?
Yes, they were actually the same exact fans, just two little everyday computer fans. And the difference is the one in the second installation, I flipped them and put them on the bottom, so you couldn't see them as well. They were a little bit more hidden, and I painted them white because I was more conscious of keeping them out of as the first thing you see. Whereas with the installation for the Brattleboro Museum, I felt like it didn't make sense to hide them. I felt like I felt like there's enough other stuff going on that that wouldn't distract anybody. It would almost be more obvious if I drew more attention to them.
Another question here. As you work with so many formats, is there a commonality in the production / creation process, like maybe a state of mind? Or do you basically reset your mindset and your process with each different format and medium?
So I always start with an image, and a lot of times I do a lot of research based around that image. It takes a long time. So that transformation of the lights to become what they were was over a course of a few years. And I think, you know, I mean, anybody that's seen me in my process, I'm always changing it. I'm always trying to update it. And sometimes it's a little tedious. It's like getting into engineering and things, but sometimes it is, you know, you can find solutions right away. But I would say I actually try to work on two different levels. So I have the things that are very immediate that I move through very quickly. And photography is a help in generating those type of gestures. And then I have things that are like long-term that I work through, that I consider to be more like grand, you know, grand ideas. I think the ideas are the same size, but they're not necessarily, they just take a while. They need to marinate. I need to work on them for a long time before I'm happy with those pieces. Yeah, and in terms of just like process, I mean, sometimes those images are things that I observe that I try to translate myself, or like to what Mara is saying, I equally prioritize things that I find. I have a lot of found image pieces or found object pieces that I try to transform, and if I'm inspired by something, and I try to make it into something else.
Cool. Next question. Could you talk more about the role of the body in your work and if it has autobiographical allusions? This may be a question from someone who knows you well.
Yeah, I think I might know who it is. The role of the body, I mean, it is the most familiar thing. I mean, it's unfortunate that I know my body more than anything else sometimes, and sometimes it's lovely. It is also a source of frustration, I think, for anybody. We all have things that we want to do with ourselves and our bodies, and be people who we want to be. But we're also, you know, I do find that it's a great tool. Self-portrait, I did a few. I showed you some things. I mean, I guess the monkey comes close. But self-portrait plays a lot in my work. I have quite a few pieces that over the years that I'm doing something that to create an image using my own body. Again, it's the thing that I'm familiar with, this thing I'm trying to transform to make the gesture. And it also, I think, enables me to enact a new pose. So there's that. And like, I think the body too is through it, you know, as an inherent romantic. I mean, it's the thing through which we observe the world. It's the thing that and so if I can become an insurgent in our perception of the body, whether it be somebody else's body or my own, if I could find a way to transform our expectations of our relationship to that, then I feel like that's a really nice place to try to activate and work in. I hope I answered your question, Mr.
He'll follow up with you privately, I'm sure. I'm being cued that there's a question here in the chat, so let me look for that. Oh yeah. So someone is noting context shifting seems to be the overriding principle of these pieces, and no direction is spared.
Context shifting, yeah, I agree. Context is supremely important to everything. I mean, it's a source of frustration too. So, I mean, honestly, it's as an artist, you want to be more than somebody who just collects things, and just. I often want to do things more than just collecting things and transforming into a different content. I like that kind of art, but it's not necessarily my wheelhouse. I want to take it to another level, and I'm not always sure where it ends. So yeah, so if, for example, with those objects, do they exist on a cushion in a gallery, or do they exist in a photo that gets sent out all over the world? I don't prioritize those gestures. I love that you can have those things exist in those different worlds. Yeah, I guess that's not really fully answered. I'm saying yes, and then I'm elaborating on why I like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I hear that. I have a couple just kind of minor questions, and then one maybe larger one that you might care to say something about. So the small questions are those rhinestone bespeckled chicken legs. What are the chicken legs made out
of? They're made with aqua resin. Okay. So yeah, I stopped working with. I try to stop working with plastic resin a while back. So I started to make things out of aqua resin, which is a little bit better for your body. But yeah, I make an opening mold out of with the actual chicken, and then I went ahead and casted them. Uh-huh. And I actually hired somebody who was into faux food finishing, a vegetarian, to work with me on creating the right palette to make the transformation of those into looking like they do.
Nice, very cool.
And they look tasty, I have to say.
Early on in your talk, you referred quickly to an author and a novel where that idea Somer comes from.
Yeah.
Can you just repeat that?
Yeah,
that
sure.
author and novel?
So she's a speculative fiction writer extraordinaire, one of my favorites of all time, and her name is Ursula Le Guin.
Oh yeah.
Sure. And yeah, Left Hand of Darkness really, I think.
Okay.
Did a lot for gender, gender dialogue back in the day, and she's followed up with a short story too, that which in her Birth of a Worlds, that talks really directly about that Somer and how it's used to manipulate bodies and such. And I think it's quite fascinating.
Yeah. Great. A couple more questions have come in here. In the pieces that have very specific technical aspects, do you go into the conceptual stage with prior knowledge of how the tech is going to work, or do you teach yourself in order to make the piece work? Which comes first?
No, that's a good question. It's really, it's hard to say that I prioritize, because like I was saying earlier, yes, I spent a lot of time engineering on 4-While. Like the one that I did for BMAC, I even went as far as 3D printing little holders for the fans to keep the fans moving without causing too many reverberations. So there's that technical side that I do really get into. Sometimes it's tedious, but you have to get into it in order to make it right. But then things happen that are out of your control, like the electrical inspector coming through and saying, "Hey, this doesn't work. What the hell do you think you're doing?" and shutting the whole thing down. And so then I'm working with somebody else who has a little bit higher knowledge, and they're working with things, and I'm trying to basically relate to them without my hands how they have to steer this piece to the concept, and it becomes a whole different level of engagement. So that process that happened in a very real outside way happens all the time in my studio. Like I'm doing that same thing with my own head. But I'll say this, like a lot of times during that process, I discover things that make me really happy about the concept in general. So the idea of using small fans to make this big gesture is really, I think, makes that poetic work. It wouldn't work if I was using magnets. It wouldn't work if I was using armatures, even if they moved almost exactly the same way. It needed to be that breath that just let things kind of move.
Thank you. The next question is, the barber towel exists on different levels as the single guest sets the vision in the individual's mind, getting the reaction from your friend, where in a room full of people, the interaction must yield different results as you can actually smell the work. How did it work in that reception environment?
No, that's a great question. It was beautiful. I mean, he actually Henry came with his tools, and one of his tools was this jar full of spray tonic that everybody could probably imagine in our mind right now what that smells like when you go into a barber. And he was spraying his towels every single time, and I had the hot towel maker in the corner just like reeking up the stuff. And yeah, it was kind of fascinating. I think you when you open the door, you probably got hit by that first. And you know, the funny thing is the gallery itself is called unisex salon, which is a very common trope around New York. There's a lot of unisex salons, and they had taken it over and made it into this other thing. So it seemed to work. It seemed to tie in. It wasn't super literal for me to go that direction, but it definitely helped it out. So
Cool.
trying to mine some history, some ghosts with that.
So I've a question on a kind of totally different track, which is Emily Mason is really like, you know, in the pantheon of heroes here in our world with Brattleboro Museum, one of the most important people in the history of our museum. And I'm curious if you want to talk at all about how your work with Emily, your relationship with Emily is or isn't reflected in your artwork.
Yeah, I would love to. I don't paint per se, although I scribble, you know, I do some things. I never showed Emily a lot of my painting work, but I always showed her my sculptures. I always show her even my computer work. Emily and I saw eye to eye on 99% of the art making process. To get the mind out of the way, allow yourself to be in the moment. The need for boredom and repast and art making, and just the formal ideas. At my heart, there's a lot of formal dialogue in everything I make, and a lot of that in terms of composition and timing. And I got all of that from looking at Emily Mason paintings. When you look at Emily Mason abstraction, you're looking at things over the course of time. You're not seeing it all at once. And in fact, if you see it all at once, if you think you got it all at once, you're maybe not looking close enough, because her paintings, when they're really kicking, are like just kind of moving. You're seeing little bits here, something else strikes you here, and they just fluctuate. So I always try to keep that in my mind, in the back of my head when I'm trying to create a composition in a 3D dimension. Emily was such a huge fan of the For a While piece. She would, every time we'd be out and about, she had to tell them about the earthquake, please. And so I would be describing it over and over again. And she was a champion for me. And she loved the chicken piece. She has one. She loved the fruit pieces. She likes the sexy stuff that I make. The only pieces I think that she, you know, sometimes it's hard for her to describe is like the still life, where it's really about computers and stuff like that. But when I backed it off for her, even that, she was like, she just embraced it fully, and it's just wonderful to see. In fact, she was at that summer opening. I didn't show the picture of her, but she was one of the first people in line to get a hot towel. And she stayed in there for a long time. Nice. But yeah, I'm, truly miss her.
Well, we had a really special experience here last fall, not long before Emily died. And she came and saw an exhibit that we had up,
yes,
work by the artist Maria Elena Gonzalez.
We talked about it a lot.
Yeah. And, she sat there and she just wanted to sit and take this in. And she just kept saying, how am I going to explain this to Stephen?
Yeah.
I have to tell Stephen about this. And it made me think that it must have been a really beautiful, reciprocal relationship between the two of you, that she was having this really powerful experience, and, where her mind was going was, how does she share that with you too?
Oh, 100.
That really struck me.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, she is the artist, and it's always, and plus she was a heck of a critic too. So I know when I'm messing up in the back of my head, like anybody who was taught by her.
I have a comment now typed in saying, "This is Mel. I brought her to the Birch Tree exhibit, and it was so special. And she spoke of Stephen the whole time, and then brought him to it later."
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it is. That was that's such a poetic piece too. It's just like that perfect synthesis of a found object and making it into something that literally the medium was transformed, and
Yeah.
Emily was really into that concept.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap this up, I feel like I want to give one more shout out to someone whose like fingerprints are all over, much of what we're talking about here in the background, and that's our chief curator, Mara Williams, who not only, brought your work, Stephen, but also brought Maria Gonzalez's and Emily's, and over the past 30 years has introduced us here at the museum and our audiences to just so much incredible artwork. So thank you again, Mara. I don't see any more open questions here. So I think we might call it a wrap. This has been just terrific, and can't thank you enough, Stephen, for taking the time, and all of you for tuning in. If you have any of you who tuned in tonight, this is a relatively new thing for us to be doing. So if you have thoughts or suggestions about how we could do this differently or more effectively, please get in touch and let us know. And I'll also just throw out there that 2 weeks from now, we're doing another artist talk. It's the photographer Allison Wright, who has a bunch of amazing photographs up right now. She's going to be talking about her work. So maybe some of you tune back in for that. And I really hope we'll see many of you in person here at the museum with masks on and from a little bit of a distance. But in person, yes, where you can really experience the art the way it's meant to be. Stephen, thank you again. Millie is also saying thank you so much for your talk. And thank you, all of you.
All right, guys. Have a good night.